It was a war that was supposed to end in 3 days, but it has been over 2 months. Russia is clearly not winning, and neither is Ukraine. It is a stalemate sort of a situation. Kiev is still standing after 60 days. In the 9th week of the war, this is what Russia controls as of now. The area in red that have made important gains in the south and east, but most of the country remains under the control of Ukraine. Currently, the West is sending more and more weapons. Joe Biden has proposed a $33 billion aid package to help Ukraine. This includes $20 billion in military aid. The Pentagon has pledged thousands of weapons to Kiev, including javelins, stingers, and heavy artillery like howitzers. Germany, for instance, has signaled a major policy shift. They will be sending heavy weaponry to Ukraine. This includes air defense systems, tanks, and armored vehicles. So the dominant theme after 60 days is this: the West calling for weapons, Russia grinding Ukraine down, and Moscow furious over the involvement of the West. As the West rushes to send weapons to Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has warned of quote-unquote lightning-fast retaliation. He said he would respond to any country that intervenes in the war and creates what he called strategic threats for Russia. Now, this comes at a time when NATO says the war in Ukraine could continue for years. So what does this mean as far as the situation on the ground is concerned? The West says it wants to see a weakened Russia. Moscow, on the other hand, has issued a dire warning. Where does this leave Ukraine? It's been scrambling for peace and is battered in many parts. With us on the broadcast is Senior Director at Albright Stonebridge Group, James Schwemlein. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Thanks very much, James, for being here with us. Sanctions, rhetoric, a lot of condemnation, strong statements coming in from the West, but none of that clearly has had any impact on Moscow's game plan as far as Ukraine is concerned. What do you make of the latest statements and the assurance that's coming from the U.S. specifically or regarding more weapons being sent to Kiev?
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I think it's actually clear that the effects of the kind of Western response to Russia's aggression have been significant. We've seen Russian forces change their strategy on the ground, shifting away from a focus on Kyiv and a focus on basically the decapitation of the Ukrainian regime, which was one of the stated goals of the Kremlin early on. We've seen a significant effect on the Russian economy play out on multiple fronts, whether it's the rapid devaluation of the ruble, whether it's the effort to shift to alternate payment mechanisms for oil exports, or the efforts yesterday that were announced to begin seizing the assets of oligarchs in part to reimburse Ukraine for the costs of the war that Russia has imposed. So I think there have been significant impacts, significant negative costs for Putin and the Russian government as a result of their aggression.
But where does this leave America's claim of standing for Ukraine and the kind of support that it had promised, but at the same time its positioning as the protector or someone who will stand in the way if Ukraine was attacked? It has been attacked for 60 days now, and the Russian assault continues. Even though we can question the pace of that offensive, ultimately Ukraine has been attacked by Russia, and the U.S. has been talking about assurances. It's been talking about more weapons being sent, but at the same time, Russia continues to attack.
Right. The U.S. security assurance in Europe is through the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, NATO. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So, assurances to defend Ukraine, assurances to help Ukraine remain independent and sovereign are different than the treaty commitments that are kind of central to NATO. The obligation is different. What we've seen is an historic really shift in European thinking about European collective security. as we've seen play out in recent weeks, looking at Finland and Sweden and their prospective shifts towards potentially joining NATO in response to Russia's active aggression. At the same time, I think we've seen a bipartisan effort in the United States, obviously with dissenters, as in any democracy, but a bipartisan effort to support the Ukrainian regime and support the Ukrainian people in the face of aggression. One of the slippery slopes that American policymakers face today is exactly what we're starting to see play out. Is once you start supporting the kind of defending side of a conflict, at what point do you begin giving too much support that the attacker begins to feel that you are a part of the conflict, that you are a combatant yourself, and we're starting to see warning signs that this could be shifting, that Russian thinking about NATO support for the Ukrainian regime could be shifting. Now, do I think that means a significant destabilization of the region? Well, I think we've already seen that as a result of Putin's behavior and Russia's conduct in this war. The bigger cost, I think, is that the continuing economic ramifications of Russia's active aggression in Ukraine are going to be felt all over the world, whether it's in food or commodity prices, or whether when it comes to even the prices that we pay every day on the shelves of our stores, that ultimately Putin's decisions have hurt a lot more people than I think they have helped.
James Schwemlein, thanks very much for joining us with those perspectives. I also want to get in on to the broadcast. Fred Weir, Russian affairs expert, with us from Moscow. Fred, good to have you with us. I remember asking you this early on when the war had started. I'm asking you this 60 days into the Russian offensive now. What do you make of the support that's come in from the West, and now the U.S. saying that despite an escalation in the rhetoric coming in from Russia, there is no actual threat of Moscow using nuclear weapons?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, we are in very unpredictable times, and we're swimming out into deep, uncharted waters. Everybody is, but of course, Russia did precipitate this awful crisis by attacking Ukraine. I think that's a point that bears repeating. But as far as I understand it, Russian military doctrine, especially as regards nuclear weapons, involves using them, first use, if Russia is facing an existential threat. I don't see how the situation in Ukraine, however nightmarish it is, would pose an existential threat. And there is a lot of loose talk in Russia. Scary talk, but I
Right, we'll just try and reconnect that line with Fred. As Fred was also pointing out, let's just talk about how the pace of this offensive has come under questioning time and again. Remember, when Russia started the offensive, this is 2 months ago, there were a lot of predictions on how fast the Russian assault would actually be going and the pace that will be witnessed on the ground. There have been a lot of comparisons that have been made over Ukraine's advantage vis-a-vis Russia's advantage on the ground as well. 2 months into that Russian offensive, we are assessing at this point, with the help of our experts on the broadcast, over what West support has meant so far and whether it's pumping in more weapons will actually change things on the ground. Fred, we lost you there for a bit. Go ahead, please, with the point that you were making.
Okay, well, I don't think, as long as there is no direct intervention in this conflict by NATO forces, that means man on man, plane on plane, that I don't think that Russians will even think of actually using nuclear weapons. I do believe the nuclear saber rattling is the warning to stay away, mind the red lines. I believe that, and I hope fervently that that is the case. As for the floods of Western weaponry that's coming into Ukraine, it really is remarkable. I mean, I watched the Russian feeds, Russian war correspondents. There are dozens of them on the ground there filming everything. And the amounts of these weapons that the Russians are capturing, they show videos of like stacks and stacks of Javelin missiles and those British NLAWs and Stingers. Like you can't fake video like that. And if they're capturing hundreds and hundreds of these weapons, gosh, how many do the Ukrainians have? It is amazing. And I think even after this awful war ends, the flood of these weapons sloshing around in Ukraine is going to be a factor in world politics and black market activities for a long time to come.
We're leaving it there for the moment. Fred, thanks very much for joining us with those perspectives. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.